Sometimes the quietest nights carry the loudest memories. The rain began before sunsets oft, at first, then steady, tracing tiny rivers down the window pane of a modest little house on the edge of town. Inside, a single lamp cast a warm amber glow across the living room, illuminating shelves filled with framed memories. Birthdays, holidays. Faces now older and quieter, Evelyn Turner stood by the window, her reflection overlapping with the storm outside. At 33, she had the kind of calm presence that people often mistook for contentment. But behind her steady blue eyes was a quiet Ica feeling that something in her life had paused, waiting for her to notice that her life had fallen into a careful rhythm. She taught art at the local elementary school, spent her evenings reading or painting, and visited her mother, Margaret, every weekend. It wasn't a bad life. It was gentle, predictable. But it was also lonely in a way she rarely admitted, even to herself. That evening, she was supposed to go out with friends from work. She had said yes at first, but as the rain began to fall, she sent a polite message saying she couldn't make it. The truth was simpler. She didn't have the energy to pretend she was fine. From the kitchen, she heard her mother's familiar voice. "Evelyn, you're sure you don't want to go out tonight?" "No, Mom," she called back softly, pulling the curtain closed. "I'd rather stay in." Margaret appeared a moment later, drying her hands on a towel. She was in her late 50s, graceful in the quiet way of someone who had carried both love and loss through the years. "Then how about a movie? It's been ages since we just sat down and watched something together." Evelyn smiled, a small, grateful smile. "Yeah, that sounds perfect." Margaret's face brightened as she walked toward the old wooden cabinet by the TV. "Let's see what we've got. Old classics or something new?" "Something old," Evelyn said. "Something that doesn't try too hard." They laughed softly at the thought. Margaret picked a DVD case that had seen better days of film they had watched countless times when Evelyn was little. The kind of movie where nothing exploded, no one ran from danger, and the ending always made them cry just enough, while her mother prepared popcorn. Evelyn arranged the couch pillows just right, making sure the blanket was tucked neatly at the sides. It was such a small ritual, yet it made her feel calm, safe. When they finally sat down, the opening credits rolled, filling the room with the soft hum of nostalgia. Outside, the rain continued to whisper against the glass. For a while, they didn't talk. They just watched, sharing quiet glances when familiar scenes appeared, smiling at the same moments, mouthing favorite lines without sound. It felt like time had paused, but somewhere between the dialogue and the laughter, Evelyn felt a small stirring in her chest. It wasn't sadness, not exactly, more like a longing she didn't understand. A longing for connection, for answers, for something unfinished. As the movie played, her eyes drifted to her mother. Margaret looked peaceful, but there was a heaviness in her face, too, the kind that comes from holding on to old memories. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn wondered what her mother saw when she looked at the screen. Did she remember the same things? The laughter, the nights when Evelyn's father was still there? It was a question Evelyn had never asked. Her father's absence had always been like a closed-door something neither of them touched. He had left when Evelyn was young, and though she barely remembered his face, she had learned not to ask why. Still, sometimes, in the quiet of nights like this, the emptiness of that silence echoed louder than any answer could. She turned back to the TV, pretending to focus. But a soft, knowing voice broke the calm. "You look lost in thought," Margaret said gently. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Just tired, I guess." Her mother nodded, but didn't look convinced. "You've been quiet lately? Is everything all right at work?" "Yeah," she said. "It's just life, I suppose." Margaret gave a small laugh. Life does have a way of feeling heavier when the rain comes. Evelyn smiled again, but didn't reply. The truth was, she wasn't sure what felt heavy anymore, the rain, the memories, or the simple fear that her life was drifting without direction. As the movie reached its halfway mark, the power flickered once, then steadied. The light dimmed for just a moment, long enough for Evelyn to catch her mother's eyes. There was something unspoken there, something that had been waiting. like a letter never sent. Margaret looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the screen. But her fingers tightened around her teacup. Evelyn noticed. And for the first time, she wondered if her mother's silence carried a story to a story she hadn't told. Outside, thunder rumbled softly, rolling across the dark sky. The room filled with the sound of rain and the movie's fading dialogue. The popcorn sat untouched now, and in that fragile stillness, Evelyn felt the shift, the kind of quiet before truth finally arrives. She didn't know it yet. But that night, her mother's next words would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her past, and even herself. For now, though, she just sat there listening to the rain, holding on to a moment that felt strangely alive, as if the universe was whispering that something was about to unfold. A quiet movie night. A warm room and two hearts carrying untold stories. Sometimes that's all it takes for a life to begin again. The movie flickered softly on the screen, its colors dancing against the darkened room. Outside, the storm-deepened rain drumming against the roof like a heartbeat, steady and constant. Evelyn sat quietly, her thoughts far from the story unfolding on the TV. Every sound, the ticking clock, the gentle rustle of her mother shifting on the couch seemed to draw her backward, into memories she hadn't touched in years. When she was a child, movie nights like this were a small tradition. Back then, the living room looked different, brighter, filled with the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. Her father used to sit in the middle, Margaret on one side, Evelyn on the other. They'd laugh at the same lines, her father's deep voice humming softly as he quoted his favorite dialogue before the actors even said it. Evelyn could still remember the way his arm rested behind her mother's shoulders, the way they shared glances during the quiet scenes, glances that spoke of comfort and love. It wasn't the dramatic kind of love people wrote songs about, but something gentler, a love built on shared routines, small gestures, the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. But those nights had ended suddenly, like a movie with a missing final scene. One morning, her father was gone. No fight. No loud goodbye, just a note and a silence that stretched through the years. Evelyn was too young to understand what had happened. But she had understood the sound of her mother's quiet crying. That sound had shaped her childhood more than any words could. As the years passed, Margaret had filled the silence with strength. She worked extra shifts, learned to fix leaky faucets herself, and never once complained. She raised Evelyn with patience and humor, turning their small home into a place that felt steady even when the world didn't. And yet, there had always been that missing piece. The empty chair at the dinner table, the space in family photographs where her father should have been. Now, sitting beside her mother in the soft light of the TV, Evelyn realized how much those years had changed them both. Margaret turned to her suddenly, catching her daughter lost in thought. "You were so quiet as a little girl," she said softly. "Always drawing, always dreaming. I used to watch you for hours wondering what you were thinking about." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I remember sitting by the window while you cooked. I'd pretend the rain was painting the glass." Margaret chuckled. "You used to call the raindrops tiny travelers. You'd say they were racing to see who could reach the bottom first." Evelyn laughed at the memory. "I can't believe you remember that." "I remember everything," Margaret said, her smile dimming, especially the days when laughter was rare. For a long moment, they both sat in the quiet hum of the storm. Evelyn wanted to ask about her father, wanted to fill in the empty spaces, but the words felt fragile, as if saying them too soon might break something sacred. Instead, she asked Mom, "Were you ever angry at him for leaving?" Margaret's eyes lingered on the flickering screen. "I was," she admitted, "for a long time. But anger doesn't last forever, just wears different clothes. It turns into silence and then, eventually, understanding." Evelyn frowned softly. "Understanding what? That people love the best way they know how," Margaret said, "even when it doesn't look like love to us." The words hung between them, gentle but heavy. Evelyn thought of her own life, the relationships that had faded, the messages left unanswered, the time she had pulled away before anyone could leave her first. Maybe she had inherited more from her father than she realized. She took a deep breath. Do you think he ever thought about us? After he left, Margaret's eyes softened. Every day, I believe he did. He just didn't know how to come back. The rain outside began to slow, softening into a whisper. Evelyn felt the warmth of her mother's hand reach for hers. They sat like that for a while, two women bound not only by love, but by the quiet ache of things unsaid. I used to blame myself, Evelyn admitted, her voice trembling. I thought maybe I wasn't enough reason for him to stay. Margaret turned to her sharply, eyes wide with tenderness. Oh, sweetheart. No, you were never the reason he left. You were the reason I kept going. Evelyn blinked away the sting in her eyes. Her mother's war. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a hush that felt almost sacred. The house seemed to exhale as if relieved after holding its breath all night. The movie had ended, its credits fading into silence, but neither Evelyn nor her mother moved to turn off the screen. They sat together in the soft flicker of the afterglow, surrounded by the scent of popcorn and rain-damp air. Evelyn leaned forward, elbows on her knees, lost in thought. Something about the night felt different finished. The conversation they'd shared, the memories they had reopened, had stirred something inside her that she couldn't quite name. Margaret stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen. I'll make us some tea, she said gently. You look like you could use something warm. Evelyn nodded absent-mindedly, her eyes still on the darkened TV. Her mother's footsteps faded into the soft hum of the kettle, and Evelyn found herself staring at the bookshelf nearby. On the top shelf sat an old photo frame, one she hadn't noticed in years. Inside was a picture of her parents taken long before she was born. Her mother looked radiant, her eyes bright and full of hope. Her father stood beside her, his arm around her shoulder, wearing a simple white shirt and an easy smile. Evelyn rose and picked up the frame. The glass was slightly dusty, but the image underneath was clear. It was strange how familiar the man's expression looked, no gentle, warm, a little uncertain. For a moment, Evelyn traced the edge of his face with her thumb. Who were you, really? She whispered under her breath, as if in answer. A small folded piece of paper slipped out from behind the photo and fluttered to the floor. Evelyn blinked, startled. She knelt to pick it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was faded, but recognizable as was her father's dot. It wasn't a letter, just a short note. If this ever finds you, Evelyn, know that I never stopped thinking of you. I kept something for you. Ask your mother about the old oak tree. Her breath caught. The old oak tree. She remembered it stood behind the house she'd grown up in, the one they'd moved from when she was 10. She hadn't thought of it in years. When Margaret returned with 2 steaming cups of tea, she froze at the sight of the paper in Evelyn's hands. Her eyes widened, and for a brief second, her composure cracked. Where did you get that? She asked softly, her voice trembling. It fell out of the photo, Evelyn said, her tone cautious. What does it mean? Margaret set the cups down carefully on the table, her hands shaking. She sat beside her daughter, her gaze distant. I didn't know that was still there, she murmured. He must have hidden it before he left. Evelyn stared at her mother, confusion giving way to curiosity. What's at the oak tree, Mom? Margaret sighed, her eyes glistening. Something he left behind. Something he wanted you to find when the time was right. The time was right. Evelyn repeated, her voice tightening. You've known about this all these years. Her mother hesitated, then shook her head. Not exactly. I found something near that tree once, a box. But I never opened it. I didn't want to reopen the wound. You were too young then, and I thought, maybe some things are better left in the past. Evelyn felt a rush of emotion, confusion, hurt, long and galled tangled together. But, Mom, it's been over 20 years. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand, her voice gentle but firm. Evelyn, I wasn't trying to keep it from you. I just didn't want you to chase ghosts. He left his share of heartbreak behind. I needed to protect you from that. Evelyn looked down at their intertwined hands, the warmth of her mother's touch grounding her. She wanted to be angry, but she couldn't be. There was too much love in the room for that still. The thought of the old oak tree stirred something deep inside her a pull. Quiet but undeniable. "Can we go there?" Evelyn asked after a pause. "Tomorrow, maybe?" Margaret looked at her, torn between fear and hope. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, I think it's time." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, live, expectant. The air felt charged with something unspoken. Like the moment before dawn when the world holds its breath for light. Evelyn set the note carefully on the table and leaned back on the couch. Her mind spun with questions. What had her father left behind? A letter, a keepsake. Something meant to explain the choices he'd made. Her mother sat beside her, staring at the same spot on the table, lost in her own memories. "You know," Margaret said softly, "he planted that oak tree the year you were born. He said it would grow with you." Evelyn smiled faintly through the emotion rising in her chest. "It's probably huge now." "It must be," her mother replied. "Strong, stubborn, and still standing just like you." They both laughed quietly, their voices blending with the soft ticking of the clock. In that moment, Evelyn realized how much love had lived in the spaces between their words all these years. The unspoken comfort, the shared endurance, the forgiveness quietly building over time, it was all there, woven into every silence. She looked at her mother and felt a warmth she hadn't known she'd been missing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Margaret smiled, her eyes shimmering. "You don't have to thank me, dear. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "When we go to the tree tomorrow," her mother said gently, "be ready for whatever we find. Sometimes truth doesn't heal right away, but it always brings peace." Evelyn nodded. "I think I'm ready." The two women sat side by side as the night deepened around them. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving only the soft glow of the streetlights against the wet pavement. A quiet peace filled the room. It wasn't the peace of answers found, but of courage gathering, of hearts preparing for change. And as Evelyn glanced at the note again, folded neatly on the table, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope morning came quietly, wrapped in soft gray light. The rain had passed, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. Dew clung to the grass outside Margaret's home, catching the early sunlight like tiny shards of glass. Evelyn stood by the window, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. Her reflection looked back at her, calm on the surface, but with a storm still flickering in her eyes. The note her father had written lay folded neatly on the table behind her. Beside her sketchbook and phone, she hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the old oak tree, its broad branches reaching into the sky. That tree had been the backdrop of her childhood, the place she'd played under, drawn pictures beside, and whispered secrets to, when the world felt too heavy. The idea that something of her father still waited there filled her with a strange mixture of fear and hope. Margaret entered the room quietly, already dressed for the day in a simple cardigan and scarf. Her face was calm, but her hands gave her away, clasping and unclasping, restless. "Did you sleep?" she asked gently. Evelyn shook her head. "Not really." Margaret smiled faintly. "Me neither." They both laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. Then the laughter faded and silence filled the space again, the kind of silence that holds both comfort and tension. Two hearts speaking and everything left unsaid. After breakfast, they set out in Margaret's old car, driving the familiar road toward the house they hadn't visited in more than 20 years. The sky had cleared, but the air still smelled of rain, fresh, clean, a little sad. Neither spoke much during the drive. Every few minutes, Evelyn glanced at her mother, wondering what she was thinking. Margaret's gaze stayed fixed on the road, her eyes distant, as though following memories instead of directions. When they finally turned onto the old lane, the site of the house came into view, smaller than Evelyn remembered, its paint faded, the garden overgrown. Yet it was the oak tree that drew her breath away. It stood taller than she ever imagined, its branches wide and strong, reaching toward the clouds. The bark was rough and weathered, but alive, powerful, like it had waited all these years for this very moment. Evelyn stepped out of the car and stared. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Margaret joined her, her voice trembling. "It always was." They walked slowly across the wet grass. Every step felt like walking through time. Evelyn could almost hear her father's voice calling her name. See the way he used to lift her into his arms? Spinning her beneath the tree's shade, and then, as if memory and reality had blurred, she noticed something, a faint patch of earth near the roots that looked disturbed. "Slightly raised, Mom," she said quietly, pointing. "Was it there?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, that's where I found the box." Evelyn turned to her. "You said you never opened it." Her mother's eyes filled with both guilt and tenderness. "I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I felt like opening it would open every wound I had just managed to close." Evelyn understood. She knelt down, brushing her fingers over the damp soil. "Do you think it's still here?" Margaret hesitated. "Maybe, but even if it's gone, the truth doesn't disappear. It just waits to be seen." Her voice broke a little, and Evelyn looked up, meeting her mother's eyes. For the first time, she saw not the strong, steady woman who had raised her, but someone fragile, human, someone who had carried too much for too long. "Mom," Evelyn said softly, "you don't have to protect me anymore." Margaret smiled weakly. "It's hard to stop, sweetheart. It's what mothers do." They both knelt by the tree, searching the soil carefully. After a few moments, Evelyn's hand brushed against something solid, the edge of a small wooden box, weathered but intact. She lifted it gently, brushing off the dirt. Margaret's breath caught. "That's I." The drive back from the old house was quieter than ever. Neither Evelyn nor Margaret spoke, yet the air between them felt full, heavy with truths finally unearthed. And words still waiting to be said. Outside the car window, the countryside passed like a moving painting, gold fields, fading sunlight, and the faint shimmer of a rainbow far in the distance. It looked almost unreal, as if the world itself was trying to comfort them. Evelyn turned the small silver locket over in her hands. Its warmth felt human, as if it still carried her father's heartbeat. Each mile brought a new wave of emotion, grief, relief, forgiveness, and something she hadn't expected. Peace. Her mother kept her gaze on the road, but her expression was soft. There was no more hiding, no more walls. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "I used to be angry at him," she admitted quietly. "I thought he left because of me." Margaret's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "You were just a child, Evelyn. You couldn't have known." "I know," Evelyn whispered, "but I still blamed myself. Every birthday, every time I saw other kids with their dads, I kept wondering what I did wrong." Margaret's breath hitched. She pulled the car to the side of the road and turned to face her daughter fully. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. "He made choices I'll never fully understand, but his love for you was never in question." Evelyn looked at her mother, her eyes glistening. "Then why didn't you tell me that sooner?" Margaret hesitated. "Because I thought if I kept the pain buried, it would fade. I thought I was protecting you. But instead, I built a wall between us." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of the engine ticking softly filled the car. Then Margaret reached over and took Evelyn's hand. Her touch trembled, but was sure. "You have every right to be angry, Evelyn. But please, don't carry my silence as your burden. I didn't know how to talk about him without breaking apart." Evelyn's heart ached, not in the way it used to, but in the tender, understanding way that comes when someone finally sees the whole picture. She squeezed her mother's hand back. "You didn't have to be perfect, Mom. I just needed you to be honest." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, she let them fall freely. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Evelyn leaned forward and hugged her. Not the careful, polite kind of hug they'd shared so often, but one that carried the full weight of forgiveness. Her mother trembled against her shoulder, years of restraint dissolving into quiet sobs. The locket was still in Evelyn's palm as they held each other, a small, shining bridge between the past and the present. After a while, Margaret pulled back and wiped her tears, laughing softly through them. "I must look a mess," she said. Evelyn smiled. "You look like someone who finally let herself feel." They sat there for a while longer, watching the sun dip below the hills. The world outside turned gold, then soft amber, then dusky blue. A flock of birds flew across the horizon, their shapes shifting and graceful, like thoughts set free. When they finally reached home, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the silence no longer carried tension. Only calm. Margaret went to make tea while Evelyn placed the wooden box on the table. For a long time, she stared at it. The photographs, the note, the locket, all pieces of a man she had once loved, once hated, and now finally understood. She realized something. Her father's love hadn't vanished with his absence. It had simply taken another shape hidden in the lessons her mother taught her in her own resilience. In the quiet courage that kept her moving forward, Margaret returned with 2 cups, setting one in front of her daughter. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "your father used to talk about how you would grow up to paint the world. He said you'd see beauty where others couldn't." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I guess I did, even in the broken parts." Her mother's lips curved into a soft smile. "Maybe that's what love really is, seeing beauty in the broken things." Evelyn looked down at her tea, the steam rising like a soft ghost. "I think love is forgiving people even when they're gone." Okay. That was the turning point. Not in loud words or grand gestures, but in that quiet, unguarded understanding. The wall between them finally cracked open, and through it came light. Margaret reached for the locket again, her fingers brushing over the engraved leaf. "You should keep it," she said. "It's yours now." "Ah." Evelyn hesitated. "No," she said gently. "Let's hang it by the window. Somewhere the sun can touch it every day." And so they did. They placed the locket on a small hook by the window where the morning light would fall through it like a prism. It wasn't just a keepsake anymore. It was a promise. A reminder that love, even when wounded, can still shine. As night settled over the house, Evelyn sat by the window, watching the reflection of the locket in the glass. Her mother had gone to bed, but Evelyn stayed up, lost in thought. For years, she had carried pain like a secret. Now, for the first time, it felt like it was no longer hers to carry alone. She looked at the stars outside, quiet, endless, steady. Somewhere she liked to believe her father could see them too. Maybe he was proud. Maybe he was finally at peace. Evelyn whispered softly. Not expecting an answer, "I forgive you, Dad." And just then, a soft wind brushed through the open window, stirring the curtains and making the locket sway gently. A small, silent nod from the past. Evelyn smiled through her tears. It wasn't just forgiveness that had changed her. It was the courage to speak what had stayed unspoken for too long. The truth had finally found its voice. Morning came with a quiet brilliance. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, catching the silver locket and casting soft reflections across the walls. Evelyn sat at the table, a warm cup of tea in her hands, feeling a calm she hadn't known in years. Margaret moved about the kitchen with ease, humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast. The ordinary rhythm of morning toasting bread, brewing coffee, pouring milk suddenly felt profound. The small acts of daily life seemed like little miracles now that the weight of the past had lifted. Evelyn watched her mother with a quiet smile. There was strength in her movements, yes, but also softness, like the calm after a storm. The woman who had carried so much pain, so many unspoken truths, was finally lighter. "Would you like some more tea?" Margaret asked, turning with a gentle smile. "Yes, please," Evelyn said. Their eyes met. And in that glance, so much was spoken without words: understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet reassurance that everything had changed for the better. After breakfast, Evelyn stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers. She walked toward the little garden her mother had tended for years, noting how the sun illuminated every petal and leaf. Her gaze drifted to the small hook by the window where the silver locket now hung. It swung lightly in the morning breeze, catching the sunlight in a way that made it glimmer like a promise. Evelyn felt the warmth of her mother's presence behind her. "It looks beautiful there," Margaret said softly. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her voice thoughtful. "It feels like he's still a part of us. Not in absence, but in memory and in love." Margaret reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Evelyn's face. "You know," she said gently, "love isn't always about being together. Sometimes it's about letting people go while keeping them in your heart." Evelyn nodded. "I think I understand that now, and I think I'm ready to move forward, not with anger or longing or questions, but with gratitude." Her mother smiled, eyes glistening. "I'm proud of you." They spent the day together in quiet companionship. They walked through the neighborhood, stopping to admire the old oak tree from a distance. Its branches swayed in the breeze, strong and steady, just as it had always been. Evelyn felt the deep rhythm of life in that tree, the continuity of love and resilience, and the promise that things could grow even after years of absence. Later, they returned home, settling in the living room with another cup of tea. This time, the old movie played again, not for the story, but for the comfort it brought, the shared memories it evoked. They laughed at the same lines, quoted the familiar dialogue, and allowed the quiet happiness of the moment to settle over them like a soft blanket. Evelyn realized that healing didn't have to be loud or dramatic. It could be found in simple moments. The warmth of sunlight on her face, the hum of conversation, the sound of her mother's laugh, the feeling of a hand holding hers without a word. As the afternoon waned into evening, Evelyn stood by the window, looking out at the garden. The locket glimmered in the sunlight, a reminder that love endured even when it was hidden. Even when it was silent. Margaret joined her, standing beside her daughter. "You know," she said, "I think your father would be happy to see this. To see us here, together, at peace." Evelyn smiled, feeling a gentle swelling in her chest. "Yes, I think he would. And so am I." For a while, they simply stood together, side by side, watching the sunlight dance across the garden. No words were necessary. The past had been acknowledged, the wounds had softened, and the love that had been lost, hidden, or misunderstood had found its way back in its own quiet way. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice soft but full of conviction. "Evelyn, life doesn't always give us the endings we expect, but it does give us moments like this. Moments to hold, to cherish, to carry forward." Evelyn turned to her mother, feeling a surge of gratitude she could not put